You're not going to have to hang around the SQL Server world very long or read very much about it until you come across this word instances. And I want to explain here what a SQL Server instance is and how it's going to affect you in the real world. The bottom line here is that I can take a Windows Server 2008 box and I can install SQL Server 2008 on that box. Now when that installation is completed, I go in and look and yeah, there's my SQL Server. Everything's working, everything's cool. I turn right around, put the disk right back in, and install another copy of SQL Server 2008 on that same machine. Yes, I can have two totally separate instances of SQL Server database running on one server. Now, why would I do that? Sometimes I need two totally separate contexts. Sometimes I just want to maintain it that way. I can have legal requirements, any number of reasons. Now, here's where we get this idea of instances. For the first instance of SQL Server that you load is going to become the default instance of SQL Server. Now, you will probably never hear the word instance when it's just the default SQL Server. So I grab the disk, I go to my Windows Server 2008 box, and I load SQL Server, and I install it on the machine. And you will hear people say that's SQL Server. They won't say that's my default instance a lot of times. Now, we can also have what's called a named instance, and that is that second and third and fourth copy of SQL Server that we install on a machine. So you're going to have a default instance and then the other installations or the named instances of SQL Server. And here's why they call it a named instance. Let's first understand named by talking about default. Load the first installation of SQL Server on a machine and I take it as the default, and notice what happens. It runs. I will always recognize and utilize this SQL Server as the name of the computer that it's installed on, the network name, or for you old timers, the NetBIOS name. Now what this means is that the name of my server was VTC class, and I install SQL Server, then the name of my SQL Server is going to be VTC class. It's going to accept that by default. Now, after I've loaded that first SQL Server, I turn around, put the disk back in, and I am now going to load a named instance. I'm going to install SQL Server all over again. This is my second SQL Server on that same computer. The first one was called VTC class. And it's now going to prompt me, and it's going to say, you know what, this is going to run as the network name of the computer, which was VTC class, plus whatever name you tell me to put on it. And that's going to be your instance name. And the way we see that is anytime we refer to this particular server in any of our code or on the network, when we're talking to that database, we're going to put the computer name, a backslash, and the instance name. So if I'm setting up a database called HR for human resources and I've already installed SQL Server on this machine, the default instance was called VTC class, if you remember, and now I'm giving this instance name HR. So I now have two SQL servers on that same server, and I can have multiple databases in either of those SQL servers. The first one is called just VTC class. The second one is called VTC class/HR. I will show you this later on after we install SQL Server, and we'll kind of look at this. One point here you need to be aware of: SQL Express always shows up more or less as an instance, and you will have to put the word SQL Express out there to access it, like in a named instance. But anyway, this is not an Express class, but just keep that in mind. Now, that's instances. You're going to hear people talk about them. You're going to read about them in the documentation. And anytime you hear instance, it probably means there are two SQL servers or more installed on the same physical server box. And the named instances are the second, third, fourth, and fifth one that were installed, and they are named or they're accessed by the NetBIOS name of the machine, backslash, and whatever the name of that particular database server is. Hope this helps understand server instances.